Before we start today's episode, here's a quick public service announcement. If you want to listen to the show in audio format, and if you're getting sick of my face, or if you don't want to spend the next 15 minutes of your life staring at this background in my face, well, feel free to subscribe to the podcast feed for this channel. As of 6 or 7 episodes ago on this channel, I decided to convert everything into podcasts. And there's some pretty interesting exclusive perks if you do sign up to the pod. There's an introduction to every one of these episodes that you don't get to access on this channel, and I plan to do more variations or more formats of this show on my podcast. So go check it out, and now let's get back to the program. Today we're gonna spend a bit of time to discuss, the really important distinction between theory and practice, because a lot of the times, whenever we want to make a change in our lives, whenever we want to educate ourselves in a certain area, there's always this little whisper at the back of our minds telling us, why should I know that? Why is it necessary for me to know that? And how do I translate what I know into practical actions? For example, a lot of people ask me, what is the practical purpose of reading literature? What is the practical purpose of engaging with philosophy? It just seems like it's a bunch of theoretical mumbo jumbo. How do we actually harvest those great insights and apply them in our lives? So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we translate theory into better practices? So before we do that, let's quickly define what theory and practice, what's the difference between theory and practice. So at least in my mind, theory is anything that offers a description or prescription on something in your environment or something that you should do. So a really good example is that if you unbox a vacuum cleaner, it comes with this booklet that's way bigger than it should be, that just runs on in 12 different languages, that tells you how to use this vacuum cleaner in 12 different languages. So, you have the user's manual, and a user's manual in this case is the theory about this vacuum cleaner. You can read the whole thing, you can study the whole thing, but unless you actually go ahead and use the vacuum cleaner, the theory is just going to remain theory. It only offers prescriptions and descriptions. And same with self-help books, and same with more theoretical books, like a philosophy book, right? You can read a philosophy book and comprehend the theory of it, but your life is not going to change unless you know how to apply this piece of philosophy in your life, unless you correspond, not one-to-one, but unless you match this theory with something in your life, unless you can find real-life examples of what this theory is pointing towards, it becomes really hard to get yourself out of that abstract realm. And at the same time, self-help books, for example, a really good example. A lot of people around this time of year, around January, they're like reading self-help books obsessively. But, how many people have actually, how many people can you say, how many people are actually taking on the burden of putting those theory into action? Probably a handful. Probably, a lot less than the amount of people actually purchasing those books. So that's the difference between theory and practice. Theory can offer you descriptions and prescriptions, but they almost never ever replace action. And at the same time, here's the thing with practice. Practice is something that only you can do. You can only engage in practice from the first person. And once you've performed an action, your environment typically gives you some kind of feedback on that action, so you can kind of refine your action. Theory in this case only provides a sort of a course correction for your actions, and whereas action is something that only you can do. And the really funny thing is, it's really hard to communicate your action with another person, because as soon as you start to explain your action, as soon as you try to give advice, that advice turns into another theory. So it would take the other person to register that advice and to sort of make sense of it in their heads and to put that into action to see what you're actually talking about. So it's really hard to directly transplant your practice into another person's head. That's why the entire advice-giving industry is so frustrating, because a lot of the times we try to put somebody's advice into action, but without realizing that this advice only works for that person. It probably doesn't work for you, right? So hold that distinction in mind. Theory does not equal action. Theory is only the map for the territory, whereas the territory itself is the action. You can only access the territory by acting your way into it. So After talking about that, now let's talk a little bit about the excess of both extremes, right? So let's just talk about something like New Year's resolutions. You have two types of people. One type of people want to accumulate all the theory. For example, someone wants to exercise more in the new year. They want to research absolutely everything. They want to research every type of exercise, aerobic exercise, anaerobic exercise. They want to research every diet, keto diet, vegan diet, carnivore diet, and they want to research everything so they have this wealth of knowledge. They know exactly what to do. When you ask them, what should I eat for optimal agility? They're like, the thing you need to do is da, 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 da. They can give you a whole list. But when you actually look at their lives, they're probably only put in 2% of that theory to use, if that. On the other hand, you have these people who are just so keen to act. They're so excited to act. They're so excited to put things into action that sometimes they run into ruts, just like the overthinker, just like the theoretician. They run into a different problem where all these actions are so infected by habits and limitations in their theory that at the end of the day, they're just gonna keep engaging in a host of their old habits. They never grow out of themselves because they don't have theory to inform them or to instruct them or to refine their actions. They're acting purely on instincts. So the danger of over theorizing, let's start there, is that it could simply turn into something that's detached from reality. So actually, here's a really cool excerpt from something that I've read like a year ago. So I was in a class writing a paper, and somehow we needed to read the seminar by the name of Theory and Practice by Jacques Derrida. I would not recommend you to read the seminar because it would make zero sense to you. And in fact, now that I'm like kind of stepping away from the academy for a little bit, it's starting to make less sense to me, certain parts of it. You start to lose all the connections that you've built in college, and what you have left are these kind of things that are more practical. At least that's in my experience. So this is one of the things that was left behind. It was a beautiful excerpt from the seminar, the second session of the seminar by Jacques Derrida, called Theory and Practice. And in this seminar, Derrida basically performed a reading of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I wouldn't go into detail about Kant. If you're interested in Immanuel Kant, go research him yourself. I'm not going to waste too much time talking about him here. But essentially, Kant had a thought experiment where he asked, what's going to happen if a person is purely involved in theory with no practice? What's going to happen to this person's life if he's living in a realm of speculative reason, if he only speculates and, if he doesn't practice what he speculates? So his conclusion is, because the way reason is structured, this person will get lost in indecisiveness. So he's going to get lost in indecision, because if you have a mind that only indulges in speculative thinking, if you have a mind that only indulges in the theoretical but never brings it out to the practical, then he's going to get lost in so many options, because logically speaking, you can have certain pieces of advice. They all sound really good on paper. If someone gives you a pretty bad piece of advice, on some level we can still acknowledge that, there's some validity to it still, even though I don't agree with it. I can kind of see how he decides to do that, right? But if you have someone who's purely in the speculative mode, he can see the validity in everything, or he can choose to disagree with everything. But at the same time, he's going to find it really hard to act, because he'll be constantly shifting from one opinion to another. He's engaged with this. He's basically in an all-you-can-eat buffet, but he's too busy thinking about the dishes instead of just like picking one out and trying them, right? So he's going to be constantly stuck in a, quote, ceaseless vacillation from one thing to the next, and he'll be stuck in a permanent rut. This is the guy who decides to research 6 different diets before cooking any single one of them. This is the guy who tries to read everything there is about personal finance without opening up a high interest rate savings account. So some throwaway examples there. But at the same time, there's another category of people who are too focused on action. If you're too focused on action, you run a risk of getting too much or too mired in your old habits of behaving. Because a lot of the things that we do, they're based on habits, they're based on how we reacted to certain things in the past. And if we purely use action as a metric, we run a risk of dismissing the theory that could really make a difference. For example, in the new year, this coming year, 2025, one of my goals is to get better at managing the business behind this whole YouTube channel. You know, over the years, I haven't read a lot of entrepreneur books on entrepreneurship, because I just thought to myself, you know, I'll figure it out. I'll just keep putting in the work and figure it out, without realizing that sometimes if I get certain tips from books on management, from books on how to manage cash flow behind a business, you know, these tips make all the difference between me feeling control and feeling like I'm in control and not stressed about work, versus me stuck in a schedule that is totally out of whack, where I'm checking emails 24/7, where I'm running out of time to actually create videos like this. So that makes all the difference. And that is kind of like me using theory to inform my practice. Whereas if I only stuck with practice, that feedback cycle is simply too slow. It takes me 10 actions to get one feedback point for me to realize what I was doing wrong. Whereas a piece of theory in that situation could really accelerate the process of the feedback for you to get some access to a piece of insight that then informs your practice that you can use to expedite your progress. So here's the interesting interplay between theory and practice. And I'm going to read out a quote from the seminar that really illuminates this point. Sometimes the only way to break out of your ceaseless speculation is by acting. How many times have you had this moment where you're completely caught up in your mind? You're thinking about this, you're thinking about that, maybe you're doom scrolling, but all it took was one conversation with a friend, one walk around the block, or one really pleasant interaction with a family member to completely snap you out of that cycle. And how many times did you have the situation where you're completely stuck in acting out a bunch of things, where you're taking a lot of actions throughout the week, but none of them seem to lead anywhere? But then you read one thing from a book, you watch one YouTube video on the subject, and you listen to one podcast that somehow like something clicked in your head, where your actions are then contextualized, or your future actions are then contextualized to orientate you into a better course of actions. So the two sides, they tend to inform each other. And then this is the quote, which is from the seminar. So, but if he, such a man, were to come to practice, this game of a purely speculative reason would vanish like the phantoms of a dream, and he would choose these principles merely according to practical interest, unquote. So that quote there kind of described this whole interplay between theory and practice. So sometimes we have certain practical interests and we have theory to back it up. And sometimes if we're too lost in theory, the counterweight for theory is action. Because that action is going to validate if the theory is going to work or not. You're bringing the map to the territory. You're exploring the territory with the map. And in other cases, when you're too lost in a territory, when you're too lost in the woods, so to speak, all you need is a little direction from the map to show you the way out. So I want you to substitute different examples of this interplay in your life. It might be a fitness goal that you have. It might be a career goal. It might be a goal with maybe you want to read more books. You know, a really simple example, you want to read more books this coming year. And then you can read books on habit formation. You can read books on, how to get better at reading. You can watch one of my videos on how to get better at reading, or read more books. But then if you don't somehow implement it, or implement some of that advice in your life, this interplay will simply get interrupted. You'll be lost in a sea of endless options. Whereas on the other hand, if you're too mired in action, if you just try to jam your head in a book every single day without some habit formation books giving you a piece of advice here and there, something for you to consider, you're simply going to be lost doing the wrong thing 24/7. It's like learning an instrument, right? It's better to form the good habits earlier on through instruction, rather than having to correct that habit later on once you've accumulated so many bad instincts or so many bad habits. So That interplay is what I want to highlight in this video. So pull up an example from your life. Here's a journal prompt for you. What aspect of my life am I indulging in too much action? And what aspect of my life am I indulging in too much theory? And how do I bring theory into my action to inform it? And how do I bring action to my theory as to break me out of that vicious cycle of being decisive? Anyway, I hope that was an illuminating video, and I hope that you guys are having a great start to your year. And I want to wish you a fantastic 2025, and I will be back next week with more content for you guys, with more interesting deep dives into stuff like this. Anyway, Robin Waldun here. Hope you're having a great day, great evening, great night, wherever you are in the world, and take care, and goodbye.